On this panel, we have Richard Costigan, who is on the CalPERS Board of Administration, and he's going to go first. And then Sean Bill, who served as a trustee for the City of San Jose Retirement Board. And then David Crane, who was also on the CalSTRS board for a short time, a few years ago. And they're going to give you their perspectives on pension governance, how it works, whether it's working, what we might consider in the future. Richard.
All right, well, good afternoon. I have a really bad cold, so I have to apologize in advance. It's also making me a little on the moody side. I really appreciate being here today, particularly for Joe Nation and David Crane. Just very quickly, David and I have worked together for a number of years, including in the governor's office, and I've known Joe a number of years. Today, I'm actually missing investment committee to be here. So I'm going to go very quickly because I think Q&A is much more important. So I chair the Finance and Administration Committee. I've chaired it for the last 4 years. I would say it's great to see all of you in this room. I'd like to actually see you at Finance and Administration once in a while. No one comes to our committees. And so I will say I've learned a lot this morning for Scott and I. Scott's my chief actuary. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about the discount rate. I do see Mr. Pellissier, and Ed is always writing about us. And I have to watch out for Adam over here, so I know this is on the record. So I just want to say, as a board member, and I've been on the board since 2011, so just a couple things, and then I'll quickly move through. I did do a presentation just because they asked for slides. I always start off with, what does Prop 13 and SB 400 have in common for me? And the answer is I didn't vote for either one of them, yet they're part of the landscape I have to deal with. I will say the other issue I think came from Orinda about the normal cost of an employee. Just a couple things. First of all, let's break down who's inside the CalPERS system. There is one state of California with 578,000 members. There are 1,439 school districts that have 706,000 members. And then there are 1,581 public agencies that have 575,000 members. What I heard a lot today was CalPERS, the monolithic CalPERS. We are a trustee of all of your funds. Who's elected in here? Raise your hand, please. Hey, so you voted for benefits, or you do collective bargaining. I don't do any of that. You make the determination of what you pay in your employees. I don't. Who's a city manager? Who's a trustee? Who's a finance manager? I know City of San Jose is here, for example, and former Mayor Reed. I think sometimes that gets lost in it. We don't set the benefits. Okay? SB 400. Joe, I'm glad you talked about 166, right? When we had SB 400, the employers, I spoke at League of California Cities last week to city managers and some elected, so I hope we'll be at Finance and Admin tomorrow. My job as a fiduciary for the system is to ensure its solvency, and we can talk about 3% and 4%, and whether that's the appropriate rate. And what is the impact to ensure the benefits I didn't agree to, or my board members, but that you all, the electeds, and the other 3,021 employers agreed to. It is our job to ensure that it gets paid. And so I know we're going to talk a little about it, and I want to go with Q&A, so I'm just going to go very quickly. As you know, Dana Hollinger, I love the discussion about insurance. Again, this is why I wish you all would come to Finance and Administration. Dana Hollinger, who is the governor's representative to the insurance industry, talks all the time about insurance rates and actuarials and what is the appropriate rate and what is the risk. I think you've heard us talk about the unfunded liability and you break it down. Are you all aware there's a COLA inside of it? You're all aware of escalators, right? All of these things that policymakers made the decision on that as a trustee, as a fiduciary, I'm responsible for. I'm going to go into one case very quickly just to tell you a little bit about those that serve. As you may know, a long time ago, CalPERS set up a long-term care program well before I got on the board. Came on the board in 2011. Our actuaries made a determination that the fund for long-term care was unsustainable and resulted in an 85% rate increase. I assume most of you read that. Those are very difficult votes. I'm going to tell you about a couple more votes I've had to take recently and what we're going to do tomorrow. I was sued as an individual defendant, not as a fiduciary, individually as a defendant the day after Christmas in 2015, I believe. It took me 3 years to get dismissed. So when you talk about boards and who serves on them, understand that we, those of us who choose to serve, like Mayor Reed and others, open ourselves to personal liability. It's a little unnerving when you have to disclose that you're subject to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and you don't know why, because you voted in your official fiduciary capacity. On Loyalton, the reason I wanted very quickly on that, when Joe raised it, if you don't know how we really take the responsibility that we've been entrusted with, City of Loyalton was the first time in a long time that CalPERS cut benefits. We cut them by, I think, a little over 40%. East San Gabriel, 191 employees that the employer quit paying for. As an elected, I don't know how many of you have actually sat in front of someone and said, I'm going to cut your retirement benefit while you're in retirement by 63%. You have people crying, saying they're going to lose their homes. I know, Joe, I know you want me to move along. So I just want to give you guys a little bit of perspective. So very quickly, tomorrow, in case you didn't know, we're also going to take up two more, versus the terminated agency, which is the TAP, which our committee has jurisdiction over, versus those that quit paying, which was the case of East San Gabriel. Loyalton did start off as a voluntary termination, then they got the true up, and then they quit paying, and it took about 2 years to work through the system. Very quickly, here's the makeup of the CalPERS Board of Administration. I serve as the representative of the California State Personnel Board. As I like to tell people, I see them when they're hired, they're fired, or they retire. So I see the entire life cycle of a state worker. As you can see, we have 2 constitutionals, we have 6 that are elected from representative bodies, and then we have myself, the director of Cal HR. The insurance industry, and those of you that know Bill Slayton, the chairman of SMUD, is the local government representative. Our fiduciary duty, happy to talk about that. That is what overrides everything I do. You see that in the issues of divestment. You see that in the issues that Scott talked about on the discount rate. Just very quickly, as chair of the Finance Committee over the last 4 years, I've actually pushed through 3 cuts in the discount rate through my committee. Only 2 that actually made it out of full board, including the most recent one that we're currently doing. And I'm happy to talk to any of y'all about what we're doing on that one. The role of CalPERS, I think, as you know, under Prop 162, the actuaries were given to us as well as all investment authority. Board education, just very quickly, 24 hours a year. Joe, I get credit for being here today, so I appreciate you letting me be able to get credit for being here. And then this afternoon when Mayor Reed and I talk about, I'll talk about some more of the governance issues, and then just some things, please look at the PowerPoint presentation. So thank you.
My name is Sean Bill. First, I have to do my disclaimer because there are many different pension boards here that I've worked with. I'm speaking for myself today and took a vacation day to come down here so I can give you my unfiltered view. My work was with the City of San Jose Fire and Police Plan for 4 years as a trustee, and then as a senior advisor to the City and County of San Francisco, and as the CIO for the VTA. So when I look at it, I think one thing, there's a lot of dark clouds about pensions that are floating around here, and we're hearing a lot about it today. And I think it's also important to kind of remember what the benefits of a pension can be. And there are actually benefits with the actuarial tables. You know, we can plan as a group for an average life expectancy rather than having to save to assume we're going to be 100. We can hire professional managers for the pension plans to manage the assets of the pension plan and give better access to investments for the beneficiaries. And you also have the economies of scale that enable you to get lower fees and reduce the cost of the investment portfolios. So I think it's important to kind of keep in mind, you know, what some of the positives are of pensions, why we originally put these things together. That said, you know, a lot of these plans are based on models from the 1930s. If we look at the 37 Act funds, the county plans, et cetera. Governance on these plans is basically half labor, half sponsor with a tie-breaking vote. I think they were originally designed for, for much smaller pools of capital. I mean, when you talk about CalPERS and $300 billion or CalSTRS, which is close to that, you're dealing with massive amounts of money that nobody ever contemplated at the time when they put these structures in place. So with that, I think that, you know, it's a question of how do you update the models that we're working with. And I think it's very interesting that, you know, we're at Stanford, we're at the center of innovation in the world. You know, Mayor Reed's done a lot to try to help innovate the governance of the pension plans in San Jose. I think that everybody would agree that the changes that they made in San Jose, bringing public members onto the boards, were all positive changes, generally speaking. that, you know, that there are downsides to having public members. You know, they tend to get more involved in the intricacies of the committees, et cetera. But generally speaking, it's been a positive thing. And in San Jose, I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the discount rate's actually below 7 now. So one of the lowest discount rates in the state. In Santa Clara, we're at 7% as well. So when I look at it, one of the great things with the city council and the labor unions in San Jose was they really did embrace the idea that trustees need to be educated. So we brought in quite a bit of outside education in terms of how can we improve our model. And we had a firm up in Canada called Cortex that was really quite interesting in what they were suggesting. So, you know, I think you've seen a big move in San Jose towards the Canadian model to a certain extent, public members on the board. There's not too many plans in California that have a majority of public members on the board. If there's any other, I don't think there's none that I know that have a majority. The model that jumped out to me is the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. And Ontario Teachers Pension Plan kind of had a big shift in 1990. And they basically said, okay, we're gonna run this as a business. And we're gonna treat it as a business. And we're gonna set up a crown corporation. And we're gonna bring an outside actuary in to talk about what our real liability is. And it was stated at $4 billion. Outside actuary said it's more like $8 billion. They sat down with the labor unions. They said, okay, we wanna ensure that your benefits are there for you to collect in 30 years. But we feel that we need to change the governance structure of the plan. So the Ontario basically said we will amortize the $8 billion deficit over a 40-year period. But we want to set up a system where we have 5 appointees from Ontario who are not affiliated with the plan. They are professional directors. And we do want labor to have representation on the boards, but that they should also seek outside representation. So 2 of the 4 labor appointees may be beneficiaries of the plan. 2 need to be outside of the plan with no connection to the plan. If you look at pension statistics around the world, many would say that Ontario Teachers is probably one of the top performing pension plans in the world. You know, I think the takeaways that I take away when I think about this is you got to get the best board members that you possibly can. You have to make sure that they know what they have to do and that they're given the full authority to do it. And the mission has to be very clear. There can't be any politics interfering with that and how they run the business, or the plan, I should say. You need to hire the best people that you can. This is another challenge for public agencies because you have very strong limits on compensation. So, you know, Ontario Teachers, for example, created an incentive program. And, you know, you get a salary and you have an opportunity to earn a bonus based on a 3-year rolling average of your performance relative to your benchmark. Seems very reasonable to me. But with the current structure, it's very hard to do that in a public system because you get a lot of public headlines. Somebody made $1.7 million, which happens all the time up in Ontario. And that would not sit well with a lot of the newspapers in the room. Then I think you have to ensure that the organization has the right resources to accomplish the mission that you're giving them. So A, have a great board. B, you gotta be able to hire and pay people and be able to retain those people. And C, you gotta give them the tools that they need to succeed. Access to the best consultants. It's very hard to travel if you work for a public pension plan. You know, you need to be out on the road and be out and investigating the investments firsthand. And then, trying to think if there's anything. The last thing I would say is that you need to have very clear communication between the boards, the sponsors, the labor unions, and the staff. And it has to be very simple. I found that a lot of times we got kind of tied up in our own dialogue and things became more complicated than they needed to be. So I think keep it simple, stupid on communication. That's kind of my high-level points.
I have no slides. I have a story. And for those of you who are a fan of Kafka, it might remind you of his novel, The Trial. So here I am in 2005, special advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger, lifelong Democrat, acting as special advisor to the governor. And some vacancies open up on the State Teachers Retirement System Board, and he asked me if I would become a member there. And I said, well, sure. I had some familiarity with defined benefit plans. I had been trustee of the company that I helped grow. We had a robust defined benefit plan that worked perfectly. We always financed it properly. We understood the math associated with doing that. So I said, sure, I'll go on this board. So I go to my first board meeting. The way it works in California is the governor appoints you. You immediately go on the board. The legislature, the state senate has a year in which to act. They can either have a hearing and confirm you for your full term, or they can have a hearing and throw you off immediately, or they can wait and do nothing, and then you go off quietly at the end of a year. I go to my first board meeting. They present me with some math, and I was a little bit like one of those cartoon characters that when they're presented with the math, or not math, they see something and they rub their eyes like this and they go like that because they can't understand the math. And the math was as follows. They were presenting liabilities owed come hell or high water by the state of California. Teacher pensions are guaranteed by the state. The districts owe them, but under California law, districts, if they default, the state has to back them up. So at the end of the day, teachers have their pensions guaranteed by the state of California, from whom I purchased general obligation bonds, for example. They were presenting liabilities owed come hell or high water by the state of California at a discount rate equal to 8%. Even though those liabilities were essentially no different, in fact, probably more than pari passu, senior to the liabilities they owed me on my general obligation bonds, and on which they were paying me maybe 4.5% or 5%. So it was the first thing that I said, I don't understand. I actually didn't say anything first. Then the next thing they showed me was that the investment return assumption that they were assuming on the assets being employed to meet the future obligations, they expected those assets to earn at 8% per annum. Now at that time, interest rates were 4 to 5% in 2005. I think they were roughly 60 to 70% in equities. So that implied that the stock market was going to double roughly every 7 or 8 years. So I innocently said at a board meeting, wait a minute, I think you're assuming a rate that is higher than you're going to earn. You should be assuming something closer to 6%, which is the historical yield for a portfolio structured like that in the 20th century. And you should also not be using your investment return assumption to report the size of your liabilities by using that as your discount rate. Your discount rate should represent the creditworthiness of the obligor, not what you expect to earn on your investments. That's what I said innocently at a board meeting. 11 months later, the state senate removed me from the CalSTRS board. And my hearing I actually had 2 hearings, and the Senate Rules Committee makes these decisions. My hearing was very similar to that scene in the movie Airplane, where there's a woman sitting in an aisle who's sort of crying uncontrollably, and people are lined up in the aisle to slap her. I wasn't crying uncontrollably. I was sitting at a table. I had brought photographs of my wife and 2 children to support me, and lined up over here were 16 government employee unions lined up with identical statements. And what were those identical statements? That I had breached my fiduciary obligation. And the reason they made that statement is because of Proposition 162 that Richard mentioned, which was passed by the voters in 1992, and I'll come back to that in a second, but caused by Pete Wilson. And this is one thing that's always very important to point out, because Republicans love to blame the Democrats all the time in California for the pension problem, but they need to be reminded always of 2 things. Republican Governor Ronald Reagan gave local and county employees collective bargaining rights in 1967, which launched the power of government employees in California. And Republican Governor Pete Wilson raided the pension fund, CalPERS, in 1991, which is what led the unions to put Proposition 162 on the ballot, which I probably would have done as well if I was one of them, after he raided their pension fund to balance his budget using cash basis accounting, which is a subject for another forum. All right, so I learned this at my hearing. Actually, I learned it a little bit before, because when they started to say they're going to come after me, I said, under what grounds you've breached your fiduciary obligation? And the claim they make is the only obligation as a board member at CalSTRS that I could owe was to the fund and its members. Not to future school children, not to future teachers, not to future citizens, and not to future taxpayers. Even though it was abundantly clear in 2005 that if they weren't truthful about the size of the liabilities and weren't truthful about the investment return they were really going to earn, the people that would get harmed were not the teachers who have a hell or high water guarantee from the state of California, but kids, parents, future teachers, and citizens. And that is exactly what has happened. In San Francisco today, a grand total of 29% of its revenues in the San Francisco Unified District this year will go to teacher salaries, down from 31% 5 years ago. And why is that? Because retirement spending has more than doubled in the last 5 years, and you ain't seen nothing yet. So the people that did this were the self-serving pension fund board members, my fellow members, and the elected officials who did their bidding in seeking to get me kicked off of the committee for simply telling the truth. And that's all because of Prop 162. And the only way to solve that is to put another constitutional amendment on the ballot, which hopefully the legislature will do sometime in the next decade, and change the responsibility of those boards so that their fiduciary obligation is to not just the members who are fine because they got that hell or high water guarantee, but the citizens and the students and the people of California. I'll point out one other thing. I've noticed from some of the discussions here today where people are trying to convince other people about discount rates and investment return assumptions. The people that work at CalPERS are bright and they are good people, and the people that sat on the board with me at CalSTRS, I think, are well-intentioned good people. But all of those people are susceptible to Upton Sinclair's statement from nearly a century ago about the difficulty of getting someone to understand something when their job depends on them not understanding it. And I found that out very much so in the pension issue in California, and you really have to change the governance so that people's incentives are different. So I look forward to your questions and debate.
Questions for the panel
Impressive.
on pension governance?
We're done.
There's one.
Yes.
Oh, Dan Pellissier.
Dan. So for those watching, the question is how can we, or how should board members feel that they're fulfilling their fiduciary obligations when in fact the funded ratios on an actuarial basis are 65 or 70%, when those are insufficient in many people's minds? Richard, do you
Right.
want to
Well,
start?
first of all, I want to thank Mr. Pellissier. Dan actually shows up at our meetings, and again, for disclosure, Dan and I worked together in the 1990s in the legislature. So he and I have been around quite a long time, and in fact, worked on pension reform in 1996. We tried a constitutional amendment. So, Dan, you raise a great question. This is one of the questions that I struggle with as a board member, and also to local government. When you look at the role that we play as a fiduciary, and it is to the solvency of the fund and the payment of the benefits, because one of the questions last week I was told, because I had raised an issue about ESG, for example, because it's difficult to determine an ROI on some of the ESG policies that we're pursuing, and I was reminded by someone in labor, that actually your fiduciary obligation is just make sure the benefit gets paid. What we have been trying to do at PERS, and I think, Dan, as you recall, when I brought up the discount rate last year, I wanted to accelerate it. You still work to get votes. You still have to work with your partners. One of the difficulties, and I appreciate the conversation about taking it down to 3 or 4%, please talk to your local government folks. I will tell you, when we tried to take the rate to 7, they came unglued. Nothing new here. They came in front of the committee and said that we would bankrupt them, right? And the argument back to my fiduciary is, where does that play in the back of my mind that if I cut the rate, if we recommend to cut the rate and vote on it, and we have this draconian effect on local governments and the delivery of services, what's the impact? On the flip side, I often worry about our good friend John Krupal over at Howard Jarvis. So the point that Orinda made about the taxpayer, you're absolutely right. When I came on the board, there are 2 revenue sources that you look at. There's what's paid in investment returns, and then there is what the taxpayer pays, and it's in the combination of 2 forms, the employer or the employee contribution, whether it's a general fund dollar or a special fund dollar. It's not all general fund dollars, as you know, because employees from DMV, for example, are paid out of special funds, so it's not just general fund dollars. So Dan, you raise a great question, and I certainly hope you continue to come to the meetings, but we have outside fiduciary counsel. For those of you that don't know, we use Ashley Dunning. So we have an outside fiduciary counsel as well as our inside counsel. And I know over there you're saying we know exactly where she came from. And so from that standpoint, Dan, the goal is to get to 100% funded. We have a process right now of trying to do that over the next 20 years. And if you go back and watch our partners, in this case local government and the school organizations, we did 2 phase-ins. We did immediately for government. I want to give the governor a lot of credit. Governor Brown deserves a lot of credit for PEPR reform. And I think your comment about the 7.5, buying it at 4, that's exactly what the governor did with making the payment of the $6 billion this year, borrowing from the pooled money interest to make a $6 billion. Some folks couldn't quite grasp the math, but actually the spread was, what, 4.5 or something like that, where they make, because those payments were due. So Dan, keep coming. I know it's not an answer to your question.
Quick follow-up? Yeah.
And I would say that's not. Well, the price isn't low enough. I mean, right now it's 7 and 7. And again, Dan, you and I have had.
These questions, I don't think people, if
Sorry.
anyone's watching the streaming, they're not hearing what Dan is saying in this debate.
Dan is saying that we have the rate artificially high. Make sure I'm capturing this right, although that's not what you said. We have the rate artificially high, and that the chickens are coming home to roost now because the rate's too high, and that the rate won't pay for the promised benefits. Okay, right? Okay, we've put a system in place, both through PEPR reform, which will take about 25 to 30 years for the new employees. It's a 2-track system. We've adopted a lower discount rate. We're going through the ALM right now. We're going to look at the discount rate again. The question for all of you, and if everybody in this room is excited about taking the rate down to 3.5%, Finance and Administration meets tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and you are welcome to come and talk to us about that. Because that's the point that you're making, Dan, is if you think the rate is too high, come and tell us how we do it. But we've actually laid out a process for you over the next 20 years where the goal is to get to 100%. That is the goal of it. The question is, how do you take your 3,021 employees with 1.8 million members? Because every time, I mean, one last point, I know, Joe, you got to go on that stuff. This is the big difficulty we're having. We can cut our risk and lower the rate and push up employer contributions. We can take on more risk and adopt a higher rate, and then when we have an 07, 08, we're going to see that liability still paid. And that's the balancing act that's going on right now. But you've been to committee, you've seen, we have reduced the rate over the last 36 months, and we have another rate reduction coming over the next 24.
David?
Oh, sorry, Sean, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think when we looked at this issue of unfunded liabilities in the past, that we thought of it as, what's the risk of an intergenerational shift in equity, right? And how do you minimize that? And what is the right rate to discount at to minimize that distribution that you're paying for benefits that you're accruing today, right? So, some people will say 3.5 is this rate. I would disagree with that. I would say that, we have long-term assets that are generally 17 years or more in our cases. And that so long as you understand the risk you're embracing, you should be a participant in risk premium, right? And so if we use Josh's earlier number at 6%, and maybe we stacked, 50 basis points for rebalancing and 50 basis points, we could argue, but maybe for active management, you're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of that 7. Maybe it's 6.5, maybe it's 7%, but over a long period of time, I think that you have a decent chance of hitting that. I think what's different this time, and looking at your guys' graphs earlier, you looked at 1999 or when we had the dot-com bust, and we eventually got back to 100%, right, in 2007 or whatever. And then we had the Great Recession. And I think what's different this time is we have financial repression, and we have quantitative easing and zero interest rates, which have really done a huge disservice to savers. And if you think about a pension fund, it's a saver. And so I think that's a big part of it. You have to understand the issues that you're grappling with are big macro drivers.
Right. So David?
Let me just say, Dan, the response to your question is they are doing exactly what they should be doing as board members in the case of employees who have a hell or high water undertaking from the state. So if you're a prison guard or you're a CSU employee or you're a teacher with a guarantee from the state, they don't need any assets. If CalPERS and CalSTRS had no money tomorrow, the only people in the state not hurt are those that have a hell or high water undertaking from the state. So it's no different. I own general obligation bonds issued by the state of California. I'm a creditor, just like a prison guard is a creditor of the state of California. Hell or high water creditor. There are no assets set aside to pay off my general obligation bond. They've got the power to tax, and it's senior in the waterfall, but it's not even as senior in the waterfall as a hell or high water undertaking owed to an employee, as virtually every bankruptcy court will tell you. So they're doing exactly what they should do, which is one of the problems. Now, that is not true of local governments that can go broke. And local employees should be scared to death about the way that CalPERS plays with the math. There's no way you will get anywhere near 100%. The math is just inexorable. You are at 63%, 68, accreting at 7% per annum. Everybody needs to understand, the other side of the discount rate coin is whatever you discounted in the past, you accrete in the future. So your liabilities are 100. They're growing 7% a year. You've got $68 of assets, which have to grow at 11% a year just to stay even. It's nonsense. And local governments and employees for local governments who did nothing wrong, many of them are going to get badly hurt, just like they've already been hurt in the cities that declared bankruptcy. You know, the day Stockton declared bankruptcy, they ended their OPEB obligations to their employees, retiree healthcare obligations. And janitors and others who were retired who had done nothing wrong immediately got post-retirement healthcare. And that is not right. And that is because these guys, not Richard, it's well past Richard. It's like, it's endemic. These guys are not being truthful about the math, and people that work for local governments are going to get hurt.
So there's a question here.
Vinciary, Vice Chair of the Board for San Jose Police and Fire. I'm also the immediate past chair of the investment committee. I've been on this board for almost 6 years now, and I have 2 observations that I'd like your input on. The first observation has to do with actuaries. As we were moving down our discount rate, I would say we were almost at a point of chastise for moving so quickly because nobody else was going in that direction. How do we handle that when we're leading the actuaries who are supposed to be advising us? Secondly, is that you're correct, we manage the assets, but we don't set benefits. And it's become very apparent that when the funds become fully funded and overfunded, there is a graph for assets. And we have no control over that. And what should we do about that? Because that has just a significant contribution to us on the downside as all these discussions around market returns and discount rates.
So the first question is essentially, you drag the actuaries kicking and screaming to a lower rate. And why is it that actuaries are so reluctant to move that? That's question number one. And question number two is about your control or lack.
Trustee, when you can't argue for benefits, when you see decisions being made that will truly harm the plan as they're granting great
Right.
benefits or taking pension holidays.
Okay, so their lack of control, your thoughts on their lack of
right, so I'll
control
go with
over
two.
benefits as well?
I'll disagree with the premise on the actuaries. It may have been the case in the past. That is not the case with Scott and his team. If you actually go back and watch the August, September, and December Finance and Administration Committee meetings, you'll see what the actuaries were actually arguing. And they were not actually arguing for the higher rate. In fact, they have taken a very conservative approach, and this goes back to how you work with your partners in local government and with the employee groups. Because quite honestly, and I have publicly said it, and Dan, and even J.J. Galincic, who's our labor representative, has talked about a rate below 6%. You say that, and we're saying it publicly, you'll get locals and employee groups going, they talk about the unaffordability. I mean, we're going through it. So I respectfully disagree, at least as it relates to our actuaries. If you watch tomorrow's hearing, you're going to see Scott and his staff talk about some presentations, and I would really encourage you to go back and look at the testimony and the staff reports that they did both in July and August and then in December, because if you recall, they did their first presentation in August, I believe, talking about lowering the rate, and then we came forward with it in December, and part of the pushback was wait until we did the ALM, which is the second question about your assets, is we were actually going through the asset liability management exercise right now to probably adopt that in February. And this goes back to risk versus rate. I mean, we can take on more public equities. I mean, with all due respect to those of you that may not like President Trump in this room, Trump has actually done well for the funds. The run-up in public equities that, again, we didn't see it. If you go back and look at it, the assumption, as I assume everybody in this room was that Secretary Clinton was going to win. We took some defensive measures last year, thinking that right now, and the economist in the room, if I recall, talked about we'd be in a down cycle recession now, that was the forward looking. Now you're sitting here having this discussion about how much risk are we willing to take. I will say one of the problems that we're running into, and back to your comment, CalSTRS is only half our size, it's $180 billion.
Yeah.
But when you take CalSTRS and CalPERS at $500 billion, it is difficult actually to find assets. We're either bidding against ourselves. We can't find to move the needle. If you look at some of the projects we've recently bought, $550 million for a solar facility down in Palm Desert, Port of Melbourne, we own Gatwick Airport, for example. It's hard to find these assets and at the same time try to figure out what that risk is. One last point just also on risk. Last year, two things. Back on the governance side, CalPERS created a CFO. I don't know if you have a CFO. It was fairly amazing we didn't have one. We created one about 5 years ago, and then we put a treasury management program into place. One of the issues that happened in 2008 was liquidity, is we had to, like everybody else, we had to sell assets. Now we run about $1 billion to $2 billion in short-term notes on the liquidity side to make sure that we can at least have 30 days worth of payments. So these are the things, the points that David makes, and what I think we'll talk this afternoon more, is on some of the governance stuff. But I would say our actuaries actually very conservative and read their reports.
Okay,
I
Sean?
would say that, I think you left one other piece out, though, the pension consultants. And I think they're both kind of, you have to kind of peel back the onion, but the pension consultants enable the actuaries. The actuary will say, well, we're referencing the pension consultants' expected return for 30 years out, and this is what they're telling us, and that's what we're modeling. So if you think about any, free market system, it's where's the bread buttered? Well, every actuary, every pension consultant knows that their clients are public pension plans. And so if they start lowering the rates too fast, they won't get hired. And I think it's as simple as that. I think, some of the Silicon Valley pension plans have been somewhat unique in how quickly they moved down, because it's years ago that we got to 7%.
There's a German proverb that sums that up nicely. His bread I eat, his song I sing.
Yeah.
So let's, one quick last question, Paul.
I just want to shift it back a little bit to the local governments, and what they're experiencing right now. It's small wonder they get concerned when you start dropping the discount rate. Maybe that's where it needs to be. Maybe below 6 is where it needs to be. But the impacts are real. My daughter's school, I'm Santa Rosa Press Democrat. My daughter's school, they just wiped out their fund for new books. Why is it? Well, their contribution rate just went up. Our parks in Sonoma County are deferred. We have huge unfunded liabilities up there. And this is after a prolonged period of growth in our county. So the question is, what are the lifelines they're getting? I realize CalPERS, their fiduciary responsibility is the beneficiaries. So is a lot of the boards that oversee these. So, but the question is, who's throwing the lifelines to the local government so that they have the tools that can really help?
So I would say that.
Just one more
yeah.
point. Pepper up great. got a second tier, but most local governments are finding second tier isn't doing it. We still have huge problems. They need that third tier, they need the hybrid plan. But what we're hearing from local governments is they can't adopt a hybrid plan because it's not being offered. They need help from the legislature. CalPERS doesn't offer it. What tools are there for the local governments to get through it? During the good times, God forbid a downturn in the economy.
So the question is, you've got fiduciary obligations as a board member. The question is, who's responsible for and who can take care of the cities, counties, special districts, and school districts that are going through a really tough time as these rates increase?
So I mean, one thing that jumps out to me is, like we were talking earlier, these are 1937 Act plans and what have you, and working for 30 years and retiring at 55 and then living for 30 years to your 85, the math just doesn't work, right? So when you back up and you look at the actuaries, you have to work longer. You have to withdraw for a shorter period of time. It's that simple. And the state and local governments have got to figure it out, or and get in front of it.
So we'll have to leave it at that. But later today, we're going to talk about, in fact, the next session is talking about how local government's responding. And we're going to hear from Mayor Reed from San Jose, Deb Davis is on the council there. And then we'll be able to have a broader discussion about what options are available to local governments. The short answer is not a lot. Sorry, real quick.
David said something which I don't think is quite right. He pointed out that, the liability is discounted at 7%, so it accretes at 7%, which is true. And then you said, because they're only 68% funded, maybe that, we have to earn 11% to get out of that. But, a large part of these contributions are to amortize the unfunded to get from 68 to 100. So it won't require 11%. It will require 7%, which is hard enough as it is. So if the employers make their amortization contributions, pay the normal cost, earn 7%, eventually they will get to 100%.
I'm not so sure I understand the point, but I want to take up your.
Yes, because it takes 30 years, but you'll get there. Is your
Yeah.
point?
You don't need to earn more than 7%. It's a long time, but it's a very long, it's a very long time.
Well, if that's the case, then all of you keep talking about the same thing, that cities and county, everybody keeps blaming the dropping of the discount rate for the increase in costs. But you can not drop the discount rate at all, and their costs are going way up because you got to pay off that unfunded liability. So it's one or the other.
Right. All right, so we're going to leave it at that. So there is lunch somewhere, Celia, right over this way. So grab lunch out here. We'll come back here at 1:30 for the next panel. Thank you.